Hello, everyone, and welcome to the CAYL Catalyst webinar series. I'm Valora Washington, CEO of the CAYL Institute, that's Community Advocates for Young Children, and we are delighted that you have joined us for this webinar series today. We are offering this series to provide you, especially practitioners, with timely, relevant, and immediately actionable information that we need to advance the profession of early childhood education and to better serve young children. We offer this webinar series free of charge. In this way, practitioners have access to the best knowledge base in our field in a conversational manner. For you who don't know, the CAYL Institute is based on 4 principles in all of the work that we do. These principles are really our power source as we work to achieve a vision of a nation where all children have a right to high quality early care and education. And that's part of our public policy, our professional practice, and professional engagement. These principles and the vision they support are not just inconceivable moonshots. They are really possible and they can be achieved because of the historic efforts of all the leaders who came before us, because of all of us who continue to pursue these goals, and because we all are working to prepare the next generation of early childhood leaders to continue and build upon these strong legacies. And one of our most important responsibilities as current members of the field is to recruit, support, and amplify new voices in the field. And this is one of the main goals of today's series. How do we build these new voices? How do we support new leadership? How do we recognize people who have leadership potential to help them visualize and share in our visions, to help them be strong communicators, to help them make challenging decisions, to motivate and inspire other people? How do we mentor these new leaders and help them develop the skills that they need, providing them with time for reflection, making sure to ask them about their aspirations, giving them constructive feedback, teaching them how to network, showing them how to network, networking with them, giving them opportunities for development. These are the kinds of questions we are going to be asking today. And as you think about these questions, we hope you'll just write in the chat, what hopes and dilemmas do we face as early childhood educators as we prepare the next generation? So as we begin this conversation, and when I think about this question, my hope and dilemmas are the same. The next generation is going to continue our legacy efforts, I am sure, of motivating the public to act toward a common goal of access, affordability, and equity for all children. It's just like Martin Luther King said, a genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. And when I think about this next generation of early childhood leaders, we're looking for people who can help mold this consensus for young children. We also think about what Warren Bennett said, leadership is the ability to translate vision into reality. And that's what we're still wanting to accomplish, transferring our high visions for young children into the realities of our public policy and the financing that we put into our early childhood system. Now, Michael Jordan told us that some people want it to happen, some wish it would happen, and others are going to make it happen. And what we want to do is prepare this next generation of leaders so that they will be innovative, they will make it happen. So we have prepared a number of resources at the CAYL Institute to help you as you think about lessons learned from fellow educators like ourselves. And today we have with us a very talented, inspiring, and highly knowledgeable panel of people who's going to help us think about this next generation of leaders. And our panelists today are Dr. Cathy Grace, who's the co-director of the Graduate Center for the Study of Early Learning at the University of Mississippi. We also have Dr. Lee Johnson, who's the Vice President of Policy at the National Black Child Development Institute. And we also have Demetria Joyce, who is director of the Early Childhood Policy Fellowship at the Bank Street College of Education. Each of them is going to share their experiences and their wisdom with us as they reflect on their programmatic efforts to strengthen new leadership. And lucky for me, I have had the opportunity to work with each of these three great leaders, and I'm really always anxious to learn from them on how we recognize, create, and support new leaderships, how we help them develop their soft skills, give them feedback, and reflect on their aspirations. So won't you join me today as we welcome this dynamic panel? And as we welcome them, a few notices. This webinar is being recorded, as I mentioned earlier, so that many of our practitioners can listen to it at a different time. There is closed captioning available for people who want it. And here's an important thing I want to say to you. At the end of this 1-hour webinar, you will see a link in the chat. That link, if you click it, will take you to an opportunity to interact with our three panelists and to directly ask them any questions that you want to. So look for the link near the end of the webinar if you want to participate in this Q&A session. And we encourage you throughout the webinar to write in the chat. Let us know who you are, where you're from, and share any questions you have. So let's move on to thinking about this next generation of education leaders. We know that leadership starts with self-knowledge, knowing yourself, then building relationships, and then building networks. We know that leadership in our field is a combination of us using our heads, our knowledge base, but we continue to bring our hearts and we put our hands to the plow as we do the work. So welcome with me, Dr. Cathy Grace, Demetria Joyce, and Dr. Lee Johnson III, as they share with us the lessons they have learned in their innovative work where they are. So let's begin by hearing from Dr. Cathy Grace. Dr. Grace, Cathy, please join us. Really anxious to hear what you have to share with us today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Dr. Washington, for this opportunity to speak with folks who have already signed up and for those who may be listening in the future. As you mentioned, you and I have worked together for many years in various circumstances, and so it brings me to the point where hopefully I can share a little bit of information today after 45 years of working in the field of early care and education, and to bring about what my main focus has been for the most of my adult professional life, and that is to look at how to develop leaders in rural areas. We have many child care directors, we have staff, we have public schools, private schools, we have family providers, we have a licensed child care, Head Start, all types of different configurations of early care and education throughout the country. But in rural areas, we have a little more of a challenge in some instances. We are sometimes remote. We don't have access to broadband. We have a very close-knit group in some small communities that are a little hesitant to take on new ideas and to really benefit from the new knowledge that we are acquiring about how children learn. Also, as with most parts of the country, rural America has taken a huge hit with regard to the salaries that the teachers are being paid that are not in public schools or Head Start. The basic license providers in many areas, and particularly in the South, where I have a great deal of knowledge, are barely above minimum wage in some states. And again, this presents a problem for our leaders and those who want to be leaders, because we are constantly trying to figure out what can we do to help promote the field of early childhood education for those that are the younger group. And I would say that in terms of those that are in their 20s to 40s, and maybe some of you who are a little younger than 40, even those that you would be considered a middle age, that we used to call it, is not middle age anymore, you're young. So I would just offer some suggestions and some thoughts. Dr. Washington mentioned the next generation of children and leaders, and that obviously means adults. What I would ask all of us to consider, and this is based on some of the challenges I've been working with the Graduate Center here for about 8 years, but I've also been at Mississippi State University for 13 years with a Early Childhood Institute, and at the Children's Defense Fund for several years in Washington. One of the main questions that I would put forth is how we're going to define leadership 5 years from now or 2 years from now. The way we define leadership in 1990, I can guarantee you, is not the way people would define it today in the field. And so are we preparing people with the skills that they're going to need to be in leadership and succeed, so that would encourage them to stay in leadership? We all have a vision of what it's like to be a leader, perhaps, but then are we really in the sense of the reality of what it will take? In several meetings lately, I've had people talk with me about AI and how is that going to interfere with the leadership efforts of some individuals because of the fact of discernment. And how do we make sure that we are communicating person to person, and that whatever we're trying to get across through internet or through social media is exactly what is intended by the profession. Also, we have to be acknowledging that we have some very deep divisions in our country right now along political lines. How do leaders transcend that divisiveness so that they can bring about what's best for children? Now, some of the courses I teach, graduate course on early childhood policy, it's back to one of the things that Dr. Washington said, and that has to do with know yourself, and how can you evaluate your own beliefs and how you can make sure your own beliefs are in line with what is best for young children in the sense of access and equity. Some of us have grown up thinking that we were very open and we were very embracing of all children regardless. But we need to be constantly scrutinizing that to see if that in fact is where we are in our world that we're living in today. Also, I would think in the two programs that we're working with right now, one has to do with teacher educators. We have a program called the Hardin Scholars, sponsored by the Hardin Foundation in Mississippi, that is providing us with, this is our 6th year of all the early childhood teacher educators in state universities and community colleges and some private ones, meeting together 4 times a year to discuss issues that relate to early childhood education from a teacher education standpoint. And as of now, excuse me, there are some new challenges on the horizon for teacher educators with regard to DEI and some other unfortunate occurrences that are happening in states. How do we address those in ways that are safe forums for teacher educators to begin to think about, and how is this going to impact their, I guess you could say, their syllabi and their instruction of their students? I'm sorry. Also, then we're going to look at another program we have for early childhood directors. And this would be for center directors in a location that's pretty remote in our state. And I'm going to try a little sip here. And this gets back into what is a leader as it's defined by your job role. And so as a director in an early childhood center, how do we go about looking at the leadership skills that they will need to not just address the early childhood, I guess you could say, automatics in terms of the class size, the ratios, the how children are expected to learn, what is appropriate styles of learning depending on the age of the child, but also how do they deal with their staff? How do they, excuse me, how do they create an environment, a culture that brings about a community within the early childhood center in which they work? in our schools of education and in early childhood preparation in general, I don't know how much true leadership opportunities have been taught systemically. The Cormick Institute and some of the others are very good. This one that we're right here with CAYL, very good in providing information in the new, I guess you could say, in the new world. But in the previous trainings that people have had, many of them have never had that as a part of what was considered their preparation. So I would again say that we have some challenges there, and we also, I think, owe it to ourselves to keep ourselves taken care of so that we don't burn out. So many of us are suffering from burnout or about to burn out, that we have to take time for ourselves, and that's another ongoing challenge. So I think that for this period of my observations, I have shared just a little bit with what I've seen over time, and also what we're faced with in rural areas, as well as across the country, looking at the type of leader 5 years from now and what that type of leadership skills will require. I would say number one is to be very much in touch with who you are as a person. How does that look in terms of how you're able to discern information for the audiences that you're going to be trying to bring together to teach leadership or to actually lead in some capacity? So I'm going to turn it over now to Demetria right now so she can share with you all about her program.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Dr. Cathy. I really appreciate this. And so this is such a great and timely conversation. Thank you to Dr. Valora Washington and the entire team for just having me be a part of this discussion. And hello to all of you who've joined us today. Thank you so much for dedicating probably the last part of your day to spend some time with us. My name is Demetria Joyce, and I am the director of the Early Childhood Policy Fellowship for Bank Street College of Education. And this work, our fellowship work, is housed in the Education Center, which is part of our Learning Starts at Birth initiative. And so this work lives and is situated there. We launched our fellowship a little bit over a year ago in response to what we all saw across the country as this unraveling of COVID-19, which placed a lot of demand on all of us, but especially on leaders who were trying to juggle many projects, including, as Dr. Cathy mentioned, taking care of themselves, taking care of their families, but also supporting our educators and our program administrators and keeping their doors open to the children and the families that we all kind of jointly serve. And so we launched this fellowship at a time when our field was also receiving significant attention through the pandemic. And we all remember, Build Back Better in our attempt to gain more funding for the early childhood education field. And so for us, this generated a huge opportunity for us to kind of lean into a long overdue need for systemic change. And so we understood, we still understand today as we look to cohort 2, we just wrapped up cohort 1, and we saw that leaders were grappling with workforce shortages, funding disparities, system-wide inequities, recovery efforts, and I think the list will probably go on and on for a lot of us. In our fellowship, we do prioritize leaders of color because we acknowledge that leaders of color have been historically and systemically marginalized and also excluded from policy positions, but not only from policy positions, but also from opportunities to really lean into those professional learning opportunities. So at Bank Street, we stood up and we said, yes, this is the work that we'll be leaning into. And we're still holding that true, again, as we look to cohort 2. And so what we aim to do in the fellowship is really to support systems leaders in creating high quality, equitable systems. And we also look to provide them safe space to bring problems of practice to support them in not only their professional growth, but their personal growth. And to really serve as a catalyst for the development of new approaches. We saw many new approaches that kind of came out of the fellowship in the hopes of overall promoting equity. And so we continue to lean into this work as, we look for our fellows to have these deep transformative experiences as they kind of unpack what's happening in their state or what's happening in their local context. And so we've done root cause analysis, we've done problems of practice, we leaned into systems thinking, we've leaned into human-centered design and liberatory practices. And we also provided all of our fellows with coaches, which I'll talk about that in just a little bit. And kind of the anchor of all of our work is a capstone project, which is a job embedded project and a vehicle that we use to support fellows in really advancing systems level change within their organization. And so when I think about the challenges and the dilemmas in the space that we are in today, I think there are many. And I think one of those, as Dr. Cathy illuminated and lifted for us, is just the divisive time that we all find ourselves in and navigating. And we also continue to find ourselves in spaces where people of color are underrepresented or not represented at all in terms of policy decision-making tables. And so we have some people of color who are able to kind of maybe break through the glass ceiling, if you will, but then they reach a glass cliff where they don't actually get to the space where they're at a decision-making table. And so from my purview, a challenge that I believe we face as we prepare the next generation of leaders is how do we support our leaders in navigating spaces, again, as we're seeing all across the country, where there is this erasure of equity and advancements that we've had, from folks before us, as Dr. Washington mentioned, to make it more equitable for the folks that are coming behind us. And so when you're thinking about, leadership context, if you look at, some states, particularly one of the states, the state that I am, you can kind of see this push out or this erasure from even using the term equity. And so when you're thinking about preparing a workforce to enter classrooms and to enter other spaces where there are going to be Black and Brown children, super diverse populations, how do we then support leaders? How do leaders navigate those spaces where they're trying to build culturally sustaining and responsive practices, but they can't say the word equity? And that, as you can imagine, and some of you may also be navigating those spaces, is quite a challenge. And so again, a wondering that I have, and something that I know systems leaders have found challenging throughout our fellowship and other leaders, is how can I advance equity? How can I create high quality, equitable early childhood systems when I cannot use the term equity? And so I think what I've seen our leaders do, because they are so tenacious and they're so resilient, is to find other leverage points in the systems that they work within to advance and improve systems and to create equitable systems. So some of those might be structural changes, which a lot of our leaders are kind of grappling with, is that, the policies, the practices, looking at how resources, how are we funding programs, where are we funding programs, how are we giving families equal and equitable access to programs. Some other avenues that folks are navigating as they try to create equitable changes while also kind of going through tough terrain is looking at relational changes and trying to figure out, how do we shift power dynamics? How do we build equitable relationships across departments, across units, across agencies, across states? After all, we all have the same common goal, and that we all want all of our children to have equitable futures and outcomes. And then a lot of our leaders really are leaning into the space of true transformation, where they are interrogating and thinking about mental models, which are the invisible paradigm, as I call them, what we all bring to our work, but we cannot readily identify, is what are the long-held beliefs, assumptions, and values that we are carrying when we are thinking about children who are racially, culturally, linguistically diverse, and how we serve those children. And so it's not easy, when you are a leader, especially if you're a leader of color and you're navigating that space. I will argue that it becomes increasingly more challenging. And so, as we look at the ecosystem of early childhood education and the particular fellowship that I work in, we work with leaders within the ecosystem of early childhood. And so that could be federal, state, city, county, or local municipality. And so when you look at policy tables by and large, it's quite apparent, again, that those tables are not diverse and often don't mirror the children, the workforce that we serve. And of course, this is problematic, as policy decisions should be inclusive and representative of the linguistic and cultural context of the leaders that serve them in every part of the ECE system. And something fascinating the other day, which I thought this was so remarkable, the other day, 2 days ago, actually, I had the great privilege of being a part of a rich conversation with some dynamic Latin leaders who uplifted a really powerful mantra of this notion of nothing for us without us. And so what does that mean? That means that leaders of color are in a space where we want to have our lived experiences and the nuances of the communities who look like us, the children in the workforce who look like us, represented in policy decisions. And we know that women of color make up the most part of the workforce and the children, serving the children. And so we need for our policy tables to be more representative and inclusive of leaders, because representation matters. So those are some of the things that I've kind of been thinking about in terms of leadership development, is really having a space for lived experience in terms of policy making, in terms of policy implementation, in terms of, equitable access, equitable opportunity, because I believe in doing so, that's how we really start to disrupt systems that hold or reinforce inequities and allows for improved policymaking. And I think we'll start to begin to see some shifts in outcomes for the workforce and for children when those nuances that live within communities that should be reflective, because I always think about, there's stories, we have our quantitative data, but there's also qualitative data, and there's stories behind all of the data. And so in my hopes, as I wrap up, I think about, leadership is one of the greatest levers for change, but we need to, ensure we have an equitable path to leadership for our next generation of leaders. So what does that look like to have that? But I'm also hopeful in thinking about the programs that, are fellowship programs, like some of us who, are on this call who are really leaning into this work. I'm hopeful that, leaders of color and all leaders continue to have access, equal access and opportunity to programs where they can continue to sharpen and increase their skills and their knowledge base, and also have a safe space to fail forward. And I also want to uplift the role and the importance of coaching and mentorship, where leaders can kind of engage in reflective practice and thinking about their practice and thinking about policy and how do we implement change. And so thank you so much for allowing me to share. And so now at this time, I will pass it to Dr. Lee Johnson. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Demetria. And thank you for taking part, all of you, in today's leadership conversation. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. Valora Washington and the entire team for their extraordinary leadership and support throughout this planning process. And I would also like to acknowledge all of you joining us today, near and far. I could see from looking at the chat, some of you joining us I've known for just a little while, and some I've known through correspondence for many years. I'm mindful of the variety of feelings, the variety of blessings which you bring to this moment, and I'm grateful to be with all of you. My name is Dr. Lee Johnson III, and as Dr. Washington so kindly shared, I serve as the Vice President of Policy at the National Black Child Development Institute, where it is my responsibility to lead our equity advancing public policy and legislative agenda, our thought leadership and advocacy initiatives, as well as our distinguished research and publications. And so I'm incredibly proud to represent NBCDI today, who is committed to being an ever-present and reliable force for keeping our beautiful Black babies and their friends at the center of our work, and continuously strengthening our relationships and connections with you and all professionals working to ensure our children have a strong start in life. Though in speaking of at the center, when I think of our babies, I think of the preschool children they soon become. I think about the teenagers that they grow up to be, and I think about the adults who walk among us, navigating this wide, wondrous thing human existence is. And many of these adults are caregivers, much like the adults around us, all that make up the village that surround young people. So I want to give a special thank you for all of the work you all do, especially with all that is going on in the world. Before coming to NBCDI, I worked at 0 to 3. And what I often say is that while I was newer to my role as a staff to NBCDI, that I'm no stranger to the NBCDI family as a former NBCDI policy fellow. But at 0 to 3, I was responsible for spearheading an infant toddler policy federal portfolio. And prior to that, I served in the state of Alabama at the Department of Early Childhood Education, primarily responsible for the maternal, infant, and early childhood home visiting federal program. And just slightly before that was an early childhood educator. So I was holding my infants, I was talking to my 2s, and I was learning alongside my 3s and 4s. At NBCDI, I am responsible for leading our policy fellowship program, which I'm happy to share with you all as a former fellow who participated in the inaugural cohort, and will name that it is more than just a professional development opportunity for emerging leaders. It is a means for creating positive and lasting change. Now, the policy fellowship was launched in June of 2019, and its sole purpose was to accelerate Black leaders to ensure leadership at the national level more closely reflects the young children that are being served across education, health, and social service systems. And NBCDI's commitment to equity in education and supporting the health and well-being of Black children and families is the impetus for this policy fellowship. And our program equips each fellow with new approaches to policy, exposes them to diverse perspectives, and enables them to develop fresh ideas for supporting racial equity, improving access to high-quality programs, and promoting the overall health and well-being of young Black children and their families. For 18 months, as I remember, the NBCDI Policy Fellows engage in intensive leadership development training, policy and advocacy training, thanks to Dr. Washington for lending her contributions to that area of the Policy Fellowship, as well as personal development training. And our approach is grounded in this concept called breakthrough action leadership, which is this model based on the principles of responsibility, self-reflection, and creating collective leadership. And I say this because we believe that effective leadership at every level for past, present, and future leaders is the foundation for both organizations and communities. Building a culture where everyone chooses to be accountable to the mission as well as the community of stakeholders in which they are a part of. And so the program's alumni, like myself and others, go on as part of this ongoing expansion of our leadership capacity and as part of the village to remain as an influential leader in our communities so that we're all driving policy and programmatic change and making a real difference for the people we serve. So utilizing, engaging, interactive programming like that of storytelling, as we know that's important. As leaders to be effective storytellers, we do that in our classrooms as early child educators, but also embracing conflict and creating opportunity, because no matter what, conflict will inevitably arise in any human community, organization, or group, like we're seeing with the challenges of erasure and division that Cathy and Demetria spoke to. And so it's important to consider all these differing approaches to leadership, the need for accountability, and responsibility with respect to culture in the larger society, which I consider to be this ongoing global reckoning, which is the whole point of this conversation that we're having as we think about cultural impact. And so whether that's examining who has access to power, examining the impact of limiting racial, sexual, gender, and ethnic cultural norms and expressions, to name a few. This reckoning has created an opportunity for us to consider how we might continue to organize our communities. And also, lastly, the policy and advocacy and personal development aspects are critical for leadership and are included in our fellowship. It's so important for us to have the effective leadership and care for self capacity, as I call it, as mid-level Black professionals alongside our friends who want to be policy leaders in the areas of early childhood education and family support for Black families. And I would be remiss not to say that with the support of executive coaching included in the fellowship, along with this personal development, it is our opportunity to invest in our capacity to develop that self-awareness, to develop those short and long-term goals for our own lives, and also to increase those tools and capacity to identify and address challenges and obstacles that typically block both personal and professional goals. So as someone who's been enriched by this policy fellowship program myself, and has been in this position to contribute to the next cohort and cohorts to come, I say it is so important for us to encourage anyone who is passionate about creating lasting change to continue to step up to the leadership challenge that we are all currently in. So when it comes to hopes, we as leaders must consistently strive to prepare the next generation to achieve the vision that CAYL has put forth of high quality, that we agree with, developmentally appropriate, culturally sensitive, and even tuition-free early childhood education. For example, contributing to the creation of a society that recognizes and values the critical importance of investing in early childhood as a foundation for lifelong health, well-being, and success is absolutely important and invaluable. My hope is that every child, regardless of their circumstances or background, can access those resources and opportunities that they need for optimal development. And at MBCDI, we envision a world where every Black child attends a school or participates in an early learning experience that affirms and expands them. Additionally, we hope to instill a strong sense of social responsibility and collective action in future leaders, inspiring them to prioritize early childhood education in their personal and professional endeavors. By nurturing compassionate and dedicated leaders, we aim to create long-lasting systemic change that benefits children and families. Now, of course, in our pursuit of this vision, there are various dilemmas that we will face. And one of the key dilemmas that is that of the persistent gap between the knowledge we have about the importance of early childhood development and the level of investment and action taken to support it. Overcoming this dilemma requires increased awareness and understanding among policymakers, communities, and the public about the long-term benefits and stem from investing in early childhood education. Additionally, addressing the disparities in access to high quality early childhood education. With all of the division in the conversations in politics, this poses a challenge. We must continue to ensure that equitable access exists for all children, regardless of their socioeconomic status or geographic location, which will require addressing those barriers as well as expanding those opportunities, as Demetria pointed out, to those communities that are often underserved or under-resourced. And so when I think about supporting and preparing the next generation of leaders, to support and prepare them to be architects of change, which I love that phrase, and to be architects of change on behalf of children, specifically, it's crucial to focus on certain strategies, like providing rigorous education and training in the field of early childhood development that can equip aspiring leaders with a deep understanding of the science and evidence behind effective policies and practices. This knowledge can serve as the foundation for driving meaningful change. Also, furthermore, opportunities for collaborative learning, networking, and mentorship can help emerging leaders broaden their perspectives, can help them build connections and learn from the experiences of others. It is important to foster an interdisciplinary approach, even, especially as I think about my near decade of professional experience in the field of infant and early childhood mental health, along with other professionals who have lived experience and lived expertise. encouraging future leaders to collaborate across sectors and integrate insights from various disciplines to tackle complex challenges. And lastly, it's necessary to cultivate leadership skills that emphasize compassionate decision-making and evidence-informed practices, promoting policies that are grounded in scientific evidence while also taking into account the diverse needs and cultural contexts of communities, which I think will be essential. So by investing in the upcoming generation of leaders and helping them gain expertise and nurturing their passion for early childhood education, we can empower them to advocate for and drive the necessary changes to achieve our vision of a high quality, developmentally appropriate, culturally sensitive, and tuition-free early childhood education system. Now I will turn it over to our time for group discussion.
Wow. Thank you so much. If everyone will just join us, Demetria and Cathy, I'm so excited. Cathy, you and I are part of a generation of early childhood leaders. And I think that listening to Demetria and Lee, we can feel confident. There are a lot of people in the next generation who are carrying that ball and moving forward. I'm so proud of the work that you all are doing. There's so many common things that you all are talking to us about. And I think I want to go to one, and I want to talk about this erasure of the whole conversation about equity and how difficult it is for many of the next generation leaders to really have the conversation about equity that is so central to our progress as early childhood education. You're seeing this in Mississippi and Washington, D.C. and Georgia, New York, all of the states that we're working in. Tell me a little bit about how this next generation of leaders can address the pushback that they may be receiving as they try to exercise their leadership.
If I can speak to that first, and I would just say this, that probably my remarks are going to reflect the region of the country that I am living in and that I have spent a great deal of time in. But I think that more parts of the country are beginning to see some of the same things, and it's perhaps even more shocking there because they had not necessarily encountered some of this in the past. I think from a leadership perspective, and as you know, I am a big policy person. I think that part of this is to make a decision around what does leadership contain or involve when we're talking about, is it leadership that's going to be in a policy range or in a policy arena, and that will require us to be a different type of policy leader than what we have in the past. And I think this goes back to, generally speaking, do we have the personalities, or we have the disposition to take on what we probably will find ourselves in some way or another. If we're going to engage in this and protect the discussions, protect the words that are being spoken, that we need to speak, and that the actions that need to be taken, we're going to have to become a much tougher group of people, in my estimation. And again, this is from my past experiences and things that I've had to go through for 25 years. And survival skills and determining, hey, I didn't know if I was going to really want to get into this because this is tough stuff. What it's going to take is for us to be tough and to have the skills to know how to make some progress, and not necessarily, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't just be passive and try to figure out how we're going to get around it, because I think it requires both things. We have to figure out how we're going to deal with right now, and how we're still going to be able to educate and work in classrooms, whether they're in higher ed or in second grade, or whether they're in pre-K. But we're also going to have another set of conversations around election of officials, how we can become more engaged ourselves in being on the ballot, how we can have a voice through different avenues that perhaps we've not had before, or not chosen, or thought we needed to. So I would just say, from my perspective, we're going to have to look at this from two perspectives and not wait around for other people to do it for us. And I think that's
Mhm.
another issue that we have to contend with, is that we don't have the time to wait. We're behind. And so
Mhm.
that would be my thoughts to your question.
Thank you for that. I know that Evelyn Moore, who is one of the founder of the National Black Child Development Institute, used to say, who if not us? And if not now, when? So when you're saying we need to be tough and we need to be able to move forward, this is a long-standing baton that we keep passing from generation to generation. It may look different from generation to generation, but the work still needs to be done. How we do the work might change. You know, Lee and Demetria, you both talked about the importance of coaching and the importance of individual development, knowing yourself. That's where it starts. Can you tell us a little bit more about that and what lessons you've learned as you've worked with this next generation of leaders in terms of really understanding who they are as leaders and how that plays out in terms of their ability and capacity to exercise leadership?
Yeah, I can answer. So coaching is kind of one of those critical pieces, as you know,
Mhm.
Dr. Washington, that's a part of our fellowship.
Right.
And I will say we not only had, some emerging leaders, but we also had seasoned leaders who
Mhm.
were a part of our fellowship. And I think the kind of unifying theme or thread that came out through coaching is a sense of folks feeling seen, valued, and heard,
Mhm.
regardless of how long they had been in this field. As a person of color, your voice is not always heard. Your voices, may often be silenced, but coaching allowed for the fellows to have the opportunity to have someone who might be more experienced to kind of acknowledge their efforts, acknowledge their work, but not only that, but also to kind of come alongside them to engage in that reflective practice and thinking about, okay, how did you apply this in your context? How did this show up in your leadership? What did you do in response to X? And acknowledging that it's okay to fail forward, because sometimes it's in that failure where you learn those
Mhm.
mistakes, and those are some opportunities. But we also know that, failure isn't always welcomed. So coaching provided a space where you can be a cheerleader, regardless of if a leader was emerging mid-career or they were more seasoned in their career. I think that was a common thread that we saw throughout. And kind of one of the pieces of the fellowship that we heard consistently from fellows that they valued the most in having a coach with some expertise come alongside them, having a safe space where they could bear their truths, they could talk about the dilemmas, because sometimes you can work in silos, or your work can be a little bit silo when you get to a certain place in your career. And so I think coaching is a critical piece in allowing for those self-reflective practices, and also to push, leaders at times where they may be a little complacent or a little scared to fly and spread their wings. And so that's a part of the strength of coaching.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Yeah, and I would just add, plus one to everything that Demetria is saying, and would add that, the imperative that I think about when I think about leadership is self-discovery. Leadership is critical to being able to walk through a world which demands your self-awareness. It demands your authenticity, demands your emotional intelligence, continuous learning, and also recognizing where your purpose and values align. As Dr. Washington would often say to the fellows, is that what we're witnessing is a cycle right now. There's a cycle where there's division. There's a cycle where there won't be. There's a cycle where everyone's working together and saying words that oftentimes wouldn't be used in a time when there will be. And so I think having that opportunity to self-reflect and have that feedback and engage in that self-reflection as part of coaching is important, but also goal setting and action planning. So yes, we see the dilemmas and what is the action that's going to come with what we see, and also holding each other accountable. And what I like to say when it comes to accountability, it really is about reminding each other of our commitment. That way we can support one another in making sure that as we develop personally and professionally, that these accountability mechanisms that include self-reflection and working with maybe perhaps a coach, which we provide in our fellowship, will contribute to that resilience and adaptability that's needed as a leader, but also will invite you into a conversation about the necessity for balancing self-care in your leadership as well.
Absolutely. I want to remind everyone that near the end of this session, in just about 10 minutes, you're going to see a link in our chat that you can click. If you yourself want to interact with our panelists, we welcome you to join us with that. Lee, I want to ask you about conflict because, nobody wants intentionally to have conflict, but, conflict is an inevitable part of a change process. How do you teach fellows to address conflict? How do we as leaders get tough, as Cathy Grace has pointed out the need to get tough? How do we, Demetria, have those brave conversations and difficult dialogues with people that need to be had if we're going to move forward? How do we do that and stay alive and survive, as Cathy Grace has talked about? I think these are important questions. As has been mentioned before, sometimes people feel reluctant, they feel afraid, and we are living in a climate where many people are being silenced. How do we deal with conflict? How do we raise our voice in these times?
Yeah, conflict is, first, what I want to say is conflict is a natural part of leadership. And it often arises as a result of differing perspectives, different goals, different priorities across teams or organization, but also teaching fellows the importance of addressing conflict requires strategy and tools to really navigate and resolve those conflicts constructively. And so that's being able to provide fellows with resources around conflict management styles, recognizing that we all come to leadership with different leadership styles, but also it's important to acknowledge active listening and communication. It's important to listen attentively to others, not just to listen for listen's sake or to reply, but also to be able to hear them. I remember Oprah Winfrey once said that everyone in the world wants to know, do you hear me? Do you see me? And does what I say mean anything to you? So that perspective of taking the empathy and perspective taking approach to really foster those skills in fellows, but also thinking about it's important to be able to negotiate as well. You have a point of view, your leader colleague has a point of view as well. So being able to navigate that conversation with emotional intelligence. And what I often say is making sure that you have a conversation where once you leave it, your dignity is still intact. And I think that is really critical for leadership. And also thinking about real world cases. So one thing I loved about the fellowship, and Dr. Washington, this, being able to provide the fellows with real world scenarios, like thinking about where we are currently, historically speaking, and what's going on in culture right now, and giving them the opportunity to address from their vantage point, from their leadership space and understanding, how would you approach that ethically? How would you address that conflict? And how will you actually even be proactive now knowing the scenario that is at hand?
Wow, that's great. I was jotted down a couple of notes and just the same thing that Dr. Lee just shared. I think one of the things just to remind leaders of is to assess what's in your leadership toolbox. What do you already have in your repertoire that you can use? And I think sometimes folks discount the strategies, the tools, the resources that they already have, that they're using on a daily basis, because they're already solving challenges and facing conflicts and, having difficult and brave and courageous conversations. And also too, and having some strategies like taking deep breaths, taking a pause. If it's not a good time to have that conversation, maybe come back and revisit again. Also too, we really leaned into systems thinking. That's one of our strands in the fellowship. And one of the tools that we used was the ladder of inference, which is a tool that really helps to make thinking visible. And so you can use strategies with your colleagues to kind of figure out, okay, where are they coming from? How can I engage in this tool? What assumptions am I making about what they may be saying? What beliefs am I adding on to, my own beliefs am I adding on to this conversation? How is my cultural context adding another layer onto what I'm hearing this person say? So it's also good to just have an open, honest communication with colleagues or others that you may be having to have a brave or a courageous conversation with, and using some tools out of your toolbox to be able to do that.
Well, I thank you all so much for sharing these tidbits from your experiences. And as you know, following this webinar, we send out to all registrants a list of resources. So people who want to dig deeper into the Bank Street program, the MBCDI program, what's happening in Mississippi, or other kinds of resources that we will make available, please look for that email so that you can learn more about it. Thank you all for your service. I'm going to wrap things up. Please join us in the Q&A by clicking on the link. Let me tell you what's going to happen next. We're thinking about leadership, the courage it takes, the skill it takes, the allies you must build. And I am myself personally very confident and very pleased with this next generation of ECE leaders, knowing that they are going to continue to pursue this vision of high quality, culturally competent, tuition-free early childhood education for all children. That is what we're moving for. If your actions are inspiring other people to dream more, learn more, do more, become more, then you are a leader. And so we ask you to dig a little deeper into your leadership, develop your skills, and be able to move forward, and to do it in community. Bank Street and MBCDI are just two opportunities to join a leadership community, and we ask you to seek one in your local community or wherever that you can find it. So let's think about where we're going with the CAYL webinar series. So we are going to start next month a CAYL webinar series that we're calling Moonshots for Early Childhood Education. John F. Kennedy's told us that, if we want to go to the moon, we should really just do it. We should move forward, and we should move forward now. He asked his staff, if you're not working on this 24 hours a day, then why not? Why can't we have a moonshot for children and achieve what we're wanting for children in the next few years? So we are going to put forward some of our vision, some of the moonshots that we want for early childhood education. No, every child included, no child excluded. That's where we're going to start in August. So we ask you to join us. It's going to be a 5-part series where we're going to lay out these moonshots that we'd like to see achieved for children in the next few years. So please continue to join us on the first Thursday of every month. If you're in Massachusetts, we encourage you to apply for many financial resources that continue to be available, and there's information about that we'll also put in our follow-up email. And finally, we want to thank you all for learning with the CAYL Institute today. We want to thank our panelists for their insight. We're asking you to click the link and join us so that you can have a question answer session and share your ideas with the panelists. On behalf of all of the CAYL team, we thank you for your participation and look forward to seeing you in the Q&A. Thank you very much.